Well, good afternoon. I suppose the first thing to say is telephones off, please. My name is Sandy Holway, and I'd like to welcome you, including those who are joining us on the live stream, to this celebration of the life of our very dear friend, Allan Gyngell. I begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, traditional custodians of the Canberra region, the land on which we gather today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today and recognise their continuous connection to culture, community and country. I note that in our gathering today we have former Governor-General, General Sir Peter Cosgrove and Lady Cosgrove, former Prime Minister Paul Keating, who will speak to us a little later, and former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans. My own friendship with Allan goes back almost 55 years. Like a number of others in this room, we met in 1969 when we came to Canberra to join the then Department of External Affairs. This was before Australia had a foreign policy, we had an external relations policy. We shared a flat in Lyons. You have to picture two young men in their early 20s, away from home for the first time. And to put it at its most generous, as living conditions go, I have to say that that flat that we shared was fairly disgusting. The only time we made a half-hearted effort at cleaning was when the owner was due to pay a visit for an inspection, and we took that fairly seriously because he was a very scary Canberra policeman. I particularly remember our unsuccessful experiment in washing our clothes in the bathtub, leaving them to season for a while, and then draping them over the furniture to dry. But things were to change. I particularly remember that every evening, Allan would walk down to the telephone box at the Lyons shops, and I can explain later to the younger people what a telephone box was, to call Catherine. And in due course, they were married. Now, although it was inexplicable to me at the time, Allan seemed to think that I should move out of our shared flat just because Catherine was moving in. I did so, however, but I was rather slow on the uptake because on the first weekend after my ousting, I went back to the flat to see whether Allan would like some company and would like to come out. I knocked on the door, and in due course it was opened by Catherine, and my first reaction was that I'd made a mistake and that I was at the wrong flat. It was unrecognisable. Shiny, clean, light-filled, open windows, curtains fluttering in the breeze, no clothes draped over the furniture, and no posters of Raquel Welch in a swimsuit or Jimi Hendrix on the wall any longer. And Catherine was indeed the love of Allan's life, from, I suspect, the first time he saw her. And she shaped and enriched his life from those earliest days right until the end. And Catherine, you have our deepest thanks for giving us this opportunity today to celebrate Allan's life, notwithstanding that I know this is such an extraordinarily difficult time for you. Our most heartfelt condolences and thanks go also to Allan's family, his children Dominic, Joe and Christopher, his grandchildren Seb, Zav, Annie, Otto, Clara, Max, Heidi and Pippin, his daughters-in-law Ali, Shell and Kat, brother Kim and sister Kathy, And at this time also in our minds and our hearts, I must say, is Alan and Catherine's other son, the wonderful Toby. So, to start proceedings today, I'd now like to invite to the stage grandson Max, who is going to read us a poem. Max, would you like to come up, mate? Here you go. Is that all right?
Thank you, Sandy. I'm going to read a poem that Grandfather really loved. He really enjoyed poetry. He would read us poems, and sometimes I would write poems for him too. The ones I wrote were admittedly less good. Words were really important to him, the way they could be used to convey important ideas and feelings. I'm grateful for him to passing that on to me too. I loved him very much. This poem is called Do Not Go Gentle Into That Goodnight by poet Dylan Thomas. It is a poem about death, but also how you live your life. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end, who know dark is right, but because their words have forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds may once have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and found the sun in flight, and learned too late, they grieved it on its way. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, here on this sad height, curse me, bless me with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Thank you.
Fantastic, Max. Thank you very much. And now could I invite Alan's brother Kim to speak to us.
Thank you, Sandy. Good afternoon. I speak on behalf of my sister Kathleen and myself when I say how devastating it is to lose your older sibling. Once you lose your parents, your older brother is the person whose approval you care most about. The one who understands the family life you grew up in, and the early life that shapes who you are. Allan was gifted, and Kathleen and I knew it. We loved him for it. We saw how other grown-ups regarded him and felt how that reflected on us just a little bit. Allan was different. We were different. Our mother, Patricia Otto, divorced in 1952, which was uncommon for the time, and took the three of us to live with our grandparents' house. I was 6 months, Kathleen was 3, and Allan was 5. We grew up without our father. I, in fact, never met him. It was a sometimes strange world of adults that the three of us navigated. Through nature or nurture, we were quite reserved children who grew up with formality which extended to our relationships. We never had an argument. We were respectful, and that I think is quite rare. Allan was an avid reader and had a natural curiosity. He lived in a world of books in a little room that we shared in Glen Iris. It was through him that we were introduced to Pete Seeger, Tom Lehrer, and of course Barry Humphries, which he introduced me to. He somehow made sense of our lives. We didn't get television until 1963, and Allan was the first person I saw do television parody. He was very funny. He wrote great little plays, which he performed with his best friend Ian. Ian died from cancer at the age of 13. That devastated Allan, and I felt him disappear from family life into his world of books. As adults, we lived very separate lives, connected by blood and a deep love that was not demonstrative, but very deeply felt. I miss the conversations we will never have. I miss the book that he will never get to write. I miss his keen observations on everything from music to politics and to family life. I miss the way he did not judge people. He was instead open and curious and accepting. Allan was a rare intellect, rare in so many ways, and so very precious to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. And now might I invite to the stage another long-standing friend of Allan's from the class of 69 and former senior public servant Rick Smith.
Thanks, Sandy. And Kim, yes, Allan will be missed. Where Allan always was, there is now a hole. It's not in the hearts of his family or his many friends, where he is, of course, forever embedded, nor in the minds or memories of so many of us. But there is now a space at the table, the real table and the figurative table, where we all enjoyed Allan's companionship, his conversation, and his warm friendship over these many years. For me, as for Sandy, that friendship began 54 years ago when Allan, with 23 others of us, several here today, walked through the small eastern door of that formidable building across the road there to join the Department of External Affairs. And soon we met Catherine too. For us at least, there never was Allan without Kathy. Allan was identifiable early, straight out of university, 1960s university, long hair, a modish dress sense, a stylish girlfriend. Surely he'd come with attitude. And he did. There was a quiet demeanour, understated, but he was always his own man. His views on matters he cared about, even at that time, were firmly anchored, and he had the courage to express them. Allan's early career took him to Burma and Singapore, and then to the newly formed Office of National Assessments. Along the way, there emerged two cornerstone beliefs which came to define Allan so clearly. The first was his conviction of the importance of Asia, and Southeast Asia especially, to Australia's interests. That conviction had been there from school days, and had only ever strengthened over the decades that followed. The second was about the place of intelligence in government. From his early days in ONA with Bob Furlonger and Michael Cook, and later from close study of the reports of the Hope Royal Commissions, Allan learned about the importance of separating intelligence assessment from policy, and that the credibility of both is at stake if that intersection is not navigated carefully. Remarkably, Allan was good at both policy and intelligence, and he went on to the biggest jobs on both sides of that divide. In the realm of policy, Allan was notably imaginative. Never one for just turning up daily and working through his in-tray, Allan thought creatively as well. Lesser people would have trumpeted the initiatives for which he was responsible. Allan never did. His ego didn't require that. Allan worked hard, very hard, as he reminded himself recently when he was making his way through his old diaries. And he wrote well, as I was also reminded when he asked me to read and comment on the first drafts of the chapters of his signature work, Fear of Abandonment. He was a good judge of people, Allan. At ONA and later at the Lowy Institute, he recruited astutely, not just to serve the immediate needs of the job, but for the longer-term benefit of both organisations. And he mentored generously and wisely, as many here have good cause to remember. Allan's domestic policy instincts were on the progressive side of centre. Inclusion and diversity were in his DNA long before they surfaced in the national lexicon. But his thinking was not hostage to New Age fashion. He considered issues on their merits, running them carefully through the filters of his own well-grounded beliefs. On foreign policy, Allan was commendably clear-minded, indeed hard-headed when he needed to be. He saw that we have to deal with the world as it is, not as we would wish it to be. He liked the term statecraft, and at the front edge of statecraft he placed foreign policy. And he never changed his view that the study of history is the best path to understanding strategy. To all this, Allan brought special personal qualities: a considered manner, a respectful and thoughtful approach to debate, and a readiness to listen. He could argue with passion, and he did, but he never lost a friend through disagreement over ideas. And he was remarkably resilient, Allan. He never allowed setbacks to define him, and he and Kathy drew on their own rich relationship to cope with their challenges as they arose. Allan read and thought widely. In our many discussions with him, not least over breakfast on a Saturday morning for the last 20 years or more, no subject was off the agenda. We didn't claim to be able to solve all the problems of the world, and consensus was rare among us, but we always parted feeling better for the conversation and for Allan's contribution to it. There was just one area in which Allan deferred: sport. He didn't disdain the subject, certainly not in the way he disdained the monarchy, or the Commonwealth and its heads of government meetings, or Rupert Murdoch. Rather, his attitude was one of disinterest, though graced at times with a little curiosity that others of us could take such interest in the subject. With one exception. Toby loved the Raiders, and he in turn led Allan to an interest in rugby league. And sure enough, Allan did develop a working knowledge of the working man's game. Not as good as Toby's, but good enough. Allan will be missed. At our Saturday morning table, and at so many tables, there will long be that space, that hole. He'll be missed, of course, by his loving family and all who counted him as a friend. And he will be missed nationally as a foreign policy analyst, the professional sobriquet by which I think he'd like most to be remembered. On the 30th of March, less than 2 weeks after his first diagnosis, Allan responded to an inquiry about his well-being from John Douth, another close friend. Allan said, "Please listen with special care, for these are Allan's words, not mine, and they're among his last." Allan said, "I'm pretty philosophical about the situation. I've had an immensely lucky life, doing work which had meaning and a much-loved family and friends. Death is the price of the entry ticket to life, and it still seems a pretty good deal to me." as it was for us all, Allan. Moderation and modesty, clarity and class, to the end.
Well said, Rick. Thank you. Now, in addition to the governmental roles in which Allan served Australia, and he did devote his life, by the way, one way or another, to the service of Australia, Allan made a rich contribution to the wider ecosystem, the intellectual ecosystem, so vital if Australia is to best understand its place in the world and to understand the world itself. He contributed to the think tanks, the universities, the conferences, the debates. He wrote, he was an author, and yes, always up with the times, he became a podcaster. Our next two speakers have particular insights into Allan's contribution in this wider intellectual ecosystem. First, I'd like to invite Heather Smith, former distinguished public servant and Allan's successor as National President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, to speak to us.
Thank you, Sandy. Well, few people have been as pivotal to shaping Australia's place in the world and to Australia's understanding of the world than Allan Gyngell. Even fewer have shaped the careers and the character of the next generation and the generation after that. Allan did both. My reflections today are on behalf of some of those generations who started as colleagues and became great friends with Allan and with Catherine. To the many of you who generously shared your beautiful personal reflections, I hope my words can capture your sadness, but also your celebration of Allan's life and of what he meant to us. These friendships span Allan's time as the inaugural Executive Director of the Lowy Institute, as Director General of ONA, as a co-author, as a member of China Matters, as co-host of the Australian and the World podcast series, as a member of the Crawford School and a member of the National Security College, and as National President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. It has been Martin and my privilege to have known Allan and Catherine through this entire period, and we treasure those memories. In all the many roles he took on, Allan changed the way this country makes, thinks, and learns about international policy. His drive and talent for mentorship was quietly ever present, with students, young officials, and emerging leaders alike. Allan always had time for others, no matter how busy he was, to have a coffee, to read a draft, or chew over a foreign policy problem. He was a quiet, gentle mentorship and a shaper of young minds. But more than that, Allan shaped our character and our values, and we are better people for it. Allan was our friend, our muse, and our mentor. A colossal intellect, yes, but it was the personal side that we valued even more. He saw in us, well before we did, what we could be. He inspired us and gave us confidence to achieve what we didn't think we had it in ourselves to achieve. He helped us find our voice and confidence so that we could play a role and contribute to thinking carefully about how Australia navigates its place in the world. It was both exhilarating and intimidating to work with him, but he was gentle, generous, and always thoughtful. And he was, unexpectedly perhaps, hilarious. He had a real capacity for joy. When he giggled, it was just infectious. Somehow he made things lighter, partly because he never took himself too seriously, but also because his focus was always how to make things better, to make a contribution. He showed us you can be a different kind of leader, a quiet, curious, and insightful voice in a loud room. He also showed us that you could be as strong and authoritative while still leading with decency, integrity, and kindness. But he had little tolerance for office politics or for the personal power games that frequent the halls of power. He was, as my friend Bruce Miller and I can attest, prone to the occasional mini-explosion in O&A. It amused us because it was such an aberration. It was over before you knew it. Even his dummy spits were strategic. Part of Allan's charm was his self-deprecation, humility, and modesty. Though a few of his O&A colleagues think he quietly appreciated having been voted by female staff during his first stint in O&A in the 1980s as having the nicest bum of all the men in O&A. It was the 1980s after all. He was an astute judge of people and situations. In his partnerships, he sought complementarity. He drew his energy from reflection away from people, but then surrounded himself with people who drew their energy from other people and discussion. But no partnership was ever more important than with our vibrant, wonderful, iconoclastic Catherine. He had the gift of taking complex concepts and conveying them in precise and understandable ways, whether over dinner, in speeches, in the workplace, or on his path-breaking podcast series with Darren Lim. Allan's way of speaking will always remain with us, clear, thoughtful, considered, ever so slightly hesitant, knowing that new information could always emerge. And if it did, he absorbed it into his thinking and moved forward. There was something about his style that helped whomever he was talking to emulate his manner. But no one could ever quite capture that unique and distinctive style. Trained as he was, Allan was always wary of groupthink. In conversations with many of us, he would lament the direction of much of Australian strategic policy in recent years. This weighed on him. He was at times exasperated and troubled by it, worried about where Australia was heading and the consequences for future generations. Against the then backdrop of a hostile polity, he was not afraid to speak out. He always spoke truth to power. But what was most striking about Allan was his silence. His silence could be formidable with meaning. When he did speak, he chose his words with infinite care. But until he spoke, you could never predict what he was going to say, a very rare thing, a sphinx-like delivery to match his emblematic sphinx-like presence. Away from the cold halls of policy, though, lay the heart of a poet. He and Catherine were Leonard Cohen fans after all. And that love of word and the ability to craft and paint word pictures meant that his writing carried unimaginable depth with immense economy. Allan, your passing is a profound loss for Australia at a time when we desperately need voices like yours and leaders like you. Your role in our lives will always be present. Many is the time now when we find ourselves wondering, what would Allan think? Allan, my friend, on behalf of the two generations come our thanks and gratitude for the times you made us think, for the history lessons you gave us, for the laughs, for the mentoring, for the friendship, and for believing in us. We are forever grateful. And for your inspiration, courage, and grace when in those last dark weeks you reminded us, as Rick just did, if death is the price of the entry ticket for life, it is worth paying. Vale Allan, you are deeply missed.
Thank you, Heather, and I'm going to just indulge myself, since I've got the microphone, in a quick editorial comment, because both our previous speakers hit on one aspect of Allan, which, of his many, many great strengths, was very apparent. He was indeed an intimidating intellect. I mean, he was a formidable intellect, Allan. And you may or may not know that once Bertrand Russell, the great English philosopher, was asked who was the most formidable intellect he had ever come across. And the expectation was that he would answer, well, it was Albert Einstein. But he said, no, it wasn't Einstein, it was John Maynard Keynes. This may or may not be approved of by the modern economists in the room, but that was Russell's view. And he put it this way. He said, every time I spoke to Maynard and we argued about something, I felt I was taking my life in my hands. And sometimes a discussion with Allan could be like that. You certainly wanted to be on your game. One of the great institutions in the ecosystem of thinking about international relations, foreign policy that I mentioned earlier is obviously the Lowy Institute. Allan was the founding chief executive, and our next speaker, Stephen Lowy, has been a director on the board of the Institute since it was established in 2003, amongst Stephen's many other leadership roles in business and more broadly. Stephen, if you would now speak to us, thank you very much.
Catherine, Dominic, Joe, Christopher and family. To all of Allan's friends and family, I want to thank you for giving me the privilege of speaking today. I do so on behalf of everyone associated with the Lowy Institute, our board and staff, past and present, my family, and especially my father, Frank. Unfortunately, it's not possible for him to be with us today. Allan and my dad enjoyed a unique and very special relationship. And I say that having watched closely the relationships that my father developed with many, many people in business and in politics over the years, not just here in Australia, but also overseas. He and Allan did indeed share a special relationship. I'll say more about that in a moment. But first, I want to place on record my family's immense gratitude for the role Allan played during the early years of the Lowy Institute, an institution which now thrives in large part because of the solid foundations that Allan helped build. We had spent almost 2 years thinking about and developing a plan for the Institute before Allan joined us. My father had been searching for a way to mark the 50th anniversary of his arrival into Australia on Australia Day 1952. He would say that whenever he travelled and read foreign papers, Australia would receive more attention for shark attacks and tennis games than for ideas. He wanted to find a way to, in his words, bring the world to Australia and Australia to the world. A lot of work had been done on the idea of a think tank, principally by our current executive director, the then very, very young Michael Fulleylove, who prepared the feasibility plan. But my dad was determined to find the right person to execute the plan. That person would obviously need deep foreign policy experience. But most importantly, that person would need to command respect across the board. Allan was known to us by reputation. While sounding him out for the role, we undertook the degree of due diligence that one would expect. Paul Keating spoke to us of Allan's unerring judgment. Unrelated to the Lowy Institute, we had come to know and value the opinion of some of Allan's closest friends and former colleagues, Dennis Richardson and Sandy Holloway. Their regard and respect for Allan, both personally and professionally, could not have been higher. So in the end, given Allan's outstanding career of public service and the endorsement of so many eminent individuals, the decision to offer Allan the role as the Institute's first executive director was an easy one. Which is not to say that everything went smoothly from the start. Both my dad and Allan were on a steep learning curve. My dad was used to the pace and rapid decision-making of the business world. Founding a think tank was an entirely new experience for him. Allan, too, was in for a mild culture shock. It was always part of my dad's vision for the Institute that others make a contribution to its success, intellectually and financially. He believed that Allan's role shouldn't be confined to ideas, intellect and research. He also wanted Allan to hit the hustings and not to put too fine a point on it, rattle the can. All of you here know, without me telling you, that this was not exactly in Allan's sweet spot. Big ideas and wise judgment, yes. Rattling the can, not so much. In an interview a few years later, Allan shared this anecdote. I remember going up to Frank soon after the first conference we held within 4 months of being established on Australian foreign policy and the age of change, and saying we were going to write about it. As most academic publications take about 2 years to come out, I thought he'd be very impressed when I said that we'd be publishing this within 3 months. I thought, how good am I? But Frank's face dropped. He was probably thinking, what have I done? Then he said, Allan, why not publish it next week? Thereafter, we increased the speed of all the things we did at the Institute. Some years later, my dad told a gathering that when he was getting to know Allan, his only lingering doubt had been that he didn't seem aggressive enough. He seemed too much of a nice guy. I needn't have worried, Frank said at the time. Yes, he is a nice guy, but he is no pushover. He can stand his ground in the nicest possible way. There's a real steel in him, and he uses that steel whenever necessary to advance the cause of the Institute. It was these qualities that cemented the very close bond that formed between Allan and my dad, a bond based on the indispensable ingredient for a successful relationship, mutual respect. That respect extended to all of us who served on the board during Allan's tenure, including some of Australia's most eminent thinkers, such as Ian Macfarlane, Ross Garnaut, and the late Bob O'Neill. Allan's achievements while leading the Institute were many. He delivered on my father's original objectives to bring the world to Australia and to take Australia to the world. In doing this, Allan encouraged a culture of intellectual freedom. He hired new talent. It would have been a safe call for Allan to surround himself with a comfortable roster of former colleagues. Instead, he gave massive career opportunities to some of the brightest new young talent that were only just emerging. Many of those young researchers who worked with the Institute in its early days today occupy senior positions in Australian life, in some cases running important institutions of their own. They include Anthony Bubalo, Rory Metcalf, Malcolm Cook, and of course, Michael Fullilove, amongst others. In his time with the Institute, Allan demonstrated the qualities that were evident throughout his career: a strong and inquiring mind, a humility that allowed others to shine, and an abiding faith in Australia and its potential to play a consequential role in the world and especially our region. Allan's enormous contribution to Australian public life is being remembered and honoured here today. And we will consult with Catherine and the family on how best to ensure Allan's legacy is recognised into the future. For our part, for my family and the board and the staff of the Lowy Institute, we will be forever grateful that Allan agreed to lend his knowledge, his expertise, and most importantly, his character to the creation of a now important Australian institution. As with everything he did in his professional life, for Allan, it was a profound act of public service. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We now have an opportunity to reflect with a piece of music which Allan enjoyed, and I take this opportunity to thank Allan's son Joe for the selection of the music at our event today. Please.
Oh, gather up the brokenness, bring it to me now. The fragrance of those promises you never dared to vow. The splinters that you carry, the cross you left behind. Come healing of the body, come healing of the mind, and let the heavens hear it, the penitential hymn. Come healing of the spirit, come healing of the limb.
Behold the gates of mercy in arbitrary space, and none of us deserving the cruelty or the grace. Oh, solitude of longing, where love has been confined. Come healing of the body, come healing of the mind. Oh, see the darkness yielding that tore the light apart. Come healing of the reason, come healing of the heart. Oh, troubled dusk concealing an undivided love. The heart beneath is teaching to the broken heart above. Let the heavens falter, let the earth proclaim. Come healing of the altar, come healing of the name.
Oh, longing of the branches to lift the little bud. Oh, longing of the arteries to purify the blood.
And let the heavens hear it, the penitential hymn. Come healing of the spirit, come healing of the limb. Oh, let the heavens hear it, the penitential hymn. Come healing of the spirit, come healing of the limb.
And our next speaker requires no introduction from me, former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating.
Yeah, thanks. Catherine, Christopher, Joe, Dominic, daughters-in-law, brothers, family members, grandchildren. None of us wanted to be here. We all thought Allan would, in my case, well and truly outlive me. But we never know when our number is up. But for 30 years, I think I spoke to Allan every week. I might have missed a week, but it would be very rare that I did. I was that close to him. And in the greatest compliment, two compliments he paid me. One was that when I left the Parliament and the Prime Ministership in 1996, he decided to leave the public service and join me privately to work in Sydney, which he did for 7 years. In that time, we were on to the things that really held us together. The thing we were most interested in, the matter that Rick mentioned earlier, statecraft. Statecraft. One of the things that always impressed him, my parents bought me an original copy of Churchill's The World Crisis for my 13th birthday, and it was inscribed by them, and Allan was very taken back by this. And of course, my two heroes in those days in life were Churchill, the moral clarity, and of course, and Roosevelt, the 20th century politician with all the imagination. So statecraft was our caper, and so we would just talk about these things all of the time. The thing is that I became Prime Minister on the 20th of December 1991, and on the 25th of December, 5 days later, Mikhail Gorbachev wound up the Soviet Union. And then just 5 or 6 days after that, President George Herbert Bush came to Sydney, and I had a meeting with him in Kirribilli. And I said to Allan, I've had the job five days and the world has changed. You know, I said, if we can't deal ourselves into something here with the magnets turned off, with the bipolarity of the Cold War turned off, I said, George Herbert's coming for a game of golf. He was coming for a game of golf with Hawkey, but if I can't get a headlock on him, I'll stand stuffed. And so I said, we're not going to waste a minute. And I said, otherwise Allan had the same contempt for the British Commonwealth heads of government meeting that I always had, that the dead tree of the Commonwealth, we'd turn up, and the only meetings an Australian Prime Minister ever attended was the South Pacific Forum, which of course was a valuable one, and the other was the Commonwealth heads of government meeting, the great world non-meeting, And I used to say to Allan, it's an affront to one's professionalism to have to go to this thing, you see. So here we were, and here's the United States. It's won the Cold War, and the first conversation with its president 5 days after that was with me, and Allan and I had worked all this up with Ashton Calvert, who was at the time my acting chief of staff, chief advisor, into what we could see for the opportunity. So we had to, and this is where we thought, how do we get ourselves into the game here? And of course, in the Pacific, the Americans ran the Pacific from the Navy, basically through the Navy out of Honolulu. There was never any real interest in America's a Eurocentric show. It had no real interest in the Pacific, but we held out the prospect, but maybe we could just turn the as yet unuseful APEC body into a useful body. We could turn it into a leaders meeting or a head of government meeting and bring the United States in at presidential level with the President of China, the Prime Minister of Japan, the President of Indonesia, and with us as a secretariat. So we got working on this. And so Allan became my chief Sherpa for the first APEC leaders meeting, which we then convinced Bill Clinton of, and that was in Seattle, of course, and then later in Indonesia, which Allan had a very great role in. When he knew he had this terminal cancer, Allan said to me that, he said, my years with you were the high point of my professional career. And I said, well, Allan, your work, and Peter Gratian, who may not be with us today, but we've turned Indonesia into a state friendly to us. When I was first a minister, the state always to be watched was Indonesia. This used to always get up my nose because I always believed Indonesia was fundamentally friendly to us, and that Suharto had actually changed the equilibrium of Southeast Asia by putting ASEAN together. And when I met Suharto, I said to Allan, whenever you get a briefing from Foreign Affairs, I always say, in the advent of the New Order government in Indonesia in 1965, from that point onwards, we had a sense of community and equilibrium through ASEAN, in which we'd be spending 4% of GDP on defence and not 2%. I said, this is said to us as ministers, but it's never said to Suharto. We never gave him the credit for doing this. And there's this very, very recessive sort of fellow, modest, very modest, quiet guy who led the non-aligned movement in the Cold War, essentially overlooked. So I go up and I said, Allan, what we should do, we should tell this bloke how much we value him and how we want to create a new relationship. We're not going to see everything through Timor. Timor is important, but we won't run the relationship through Timor. And so Allan and I started thinking about how we could bind things together and be very clear in our discussions, which he sat in with me, with President Suharto, that Indonesia had no territorial designs on Australia and we had no territorial designs on it. And I suggested, against the wishes of most of the departments, that we try and enter into an ANZUS worded treaty, a treaty of consultation, but essentially in a bad circumstance, a mutual defence treaty. And I said to Allan, we can't pull a ring of steel round Australia, but we can pull a reasonably big fence of barbed wire, which will be staffed broadly by Indonesians and by us. And we got working on that, and of course that treaty we signed in November 1995, from the moment of its signature, I said this to him a few weeks back, from the moment of its signature, Indonesia's relations with Australia improved and never changed again. In other words, the ballast in the current Australia-Indonesia relationship is those years that Allan and I spent with Suharto and pulling that agreement together. So I said, Allan, you can think about many achievements in life, but for an island continent coming together with the archipelago around it is a fantastic achievement and one that few people could have thought of or would have done. See, Allan was modest, but he did believe in power. Allan did believe in power. He did believe in shifting things around. You know, Allan was not a commentator. He was a doer. He often made this point about, I'm an analyst, I'm not a strategist. He said strategists see things in blacks and whites and analysts see all the greys. Well, that's true, but he did love power and its use. But he had this great sense about, you know, a great strategic sense, that is, that a bit like, say, a big adagio movement by Bruckner or Mahler would have itinerant tunes running across it. Allan would be onto the itinerant tunes in foreign policy. He would see them as basically fissures in a structure and look at them. And he knew foreign policy was messy. It was never clean. It wasn't blacks and whites. It was all greys and it was messy. So he always had a premium on nuance. He knew foreign policy was complex, and the fact is this, if you like, he knew to take note of the itinerant qualities, the itinerancy. He knew to take note of the itinerancy and to understand that fractures in the monolith meant there are issues for us to consider and to digest. We had, in the years he spent with me, which was from 1996 till he started with the Lowy Institute, 2003, we had two big campaigns. One was to stop the Europeans sucking the low countries, the peripheral countries into the euro. That is, to stop Germany and France pulling Spain, Portugal, Greece, Ireland into the euro, which we knew would kill them, and subsequently, of course, it did. And the second one was bailing up the Americans over the extension of NATO, to stop the Americans extending NATO. And I knocked up a speech with Allan for the University of Sydney in University of New South Wales in 1997, talking about the danger of biting off bits of the Russian pie crust and extending NATO, as the Clinton administration were then thinking about Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and of course they threw caution to the wind, and we're kind of now we're all living with that result today. So we ran that campaign. I was seeing French and American, including then Clinton and his staff, about this, urging him to wind NATO up, and if not wind it up, not extend it. And that kept us going until 5 or 6 years, and I'd be doing public policy speeches and he would do the same. He had a great sense of the structure of the world, and he was a great Australian nationalist, you know. Manning Clark, I used to see a lot of Manning. He liked music, he loved Richard Strauss, and we used to play the tone poems up there, Zarathustra, Don Juan, you know, Death and Transfiguration. And of course, Manning used to pin people for being Austral-Australians, Austral Britons. That is, people like Menzies and the conservative ministries between the wars, as being not certain whether they were Australian. You know, who was it said that the foreign policy of Britain is the foreign policy of Australia. He's now got his name on the Foreign Affairs building, which I built with Gareth. And I said to Kevin, you should knock that name off, Kevin. Kevin didn't do it. Anyway, Manning called these people Austral Britons, and of course now I think we have in this country a bunch of Austral Americans. Well, I'll tell you one thing, Allan Gyngell was not an Austral American. He was an Australian nationalist. He believed in an Australian foreign policy, and we used to say to each other, when they were handing out continents, not many people got one, but we did, a continent of ourselves, a border with no one, and we're trying to fabricate an enemy 11 flying hours away with no territorial disputes. You know, what's gone wrong? So he was a quiet and modest and lovely guy, but he was a real pusher. He was a real pusher. He loved power and he loved its use. For the bit that I was around, at least we got a few things. At least now we sit every year, and have for 31 years, with the US President, the Japanese Prime Minister, the Indonesian President, etc. It's that hopeless Commonwealth head of government meeting. So Allan took great pride in this. So I said to him, just before he died, I said, you know, you've got your name on the maker's label of the relationship with Indonesia. That'll never change now, you know. And he was a great figure. He had as that picture shows, he had a very lovely smile, and a smile absolutely full of kindness. Thank you.
I'd like to suggest to perhaps the academics in the audience, maybe others, that there may be a very good book in Allan Gyngell's relationship with Paul Keating on foreign policy. I only say this, Paul, because I think you already got the title for the book. I love it anyway, I'd buy it. The title's going to be Statecraft Was Our Caper. I think that's fantastic. I'd now like to introduce somebody who is a professional colleague of Allan's, but more importantly, a very long-standing friend of Allan and Catherine, Jeremy Newman.
Thank you, Sandy. I knew Allan as a colleague and a friend for 40 years, from our time in the Washington Embassy in the early 1980s to his last days. And he was always the same kind, thoughtful, courteous man. And now I just want to sketch briefly some glimpses of the more private Allan. What stood out for me over the years was how much he loved books and his continued curiosity about history, classics, and literature. He was quite unlike any of the public servants I had met at that stage. And I'm not alone in seeing this side of Allan. Rory Medcalf has told me of taking Allan to an old bookshop in New Delhi with an exquisite selection of novels, history, and poetry. After a silent hour of browsing, Allan turned and said, with incredulity and joy, "This place has every book I have ever loved." So it wasn't a surprise to me at all when he said, "Here's to our teachers," as he recalled Lucy Mayo, who taught him history at Ashwood High over 60 years ago, and she was the woman who fostered his interest in foreign policy. That was in his last podcast with Darren Lim, to whom we should all be grateful for giving Allan a public voice. Cicero wrote, "Mens cuiusque is est quisqueque." The mind of the man is the man himself. And now I can see Allan raising his eyebrows, giving his quizzical look, and crisply editing. The mind is the man. And so it was of Allan. On Allan's desk at the time of his death lay a copy of Cicero's work on old age, De Senectute. He had been drawing on its thoughts for some years, and he spoke about it from time to time. It helped him to understand the human condition and to think about the conduct of a fulfilled life. He knew that the classics could add a depth of wisdom to his own experience, and he used it in practical ways. Go back to 2018, and he told Lisa Murray that he took 3 pieces of advice from Cicero. Being young wasn't as good as you think. Learn new things and spend time with young people. And he did that. I can never forget his excitement on the release of Robert Fagel's translations of the Odyssey and the Iliad back in the 1990s. Had I read them? No. You must, and I did. But it was this enthusiasm for the classics and for history, as much as his 50 years' work on foreign policy, that let him say, or point out, as he did to so many people, that what might seem new had all happened before. History meant a great deal to Allan, and it prepared him well for his time in the Prime Minister's office. From talking to Allan at the time, I could see that the experience changed him, giving him for the first time a hands-on role in driving foreign policy. He got a real sense of agency, the power that the former Prime Minister was speaking about. And that reaffirmed for him his belief in understanding history as a key to shaping Australia's interactions with the world. Allan wasn't a demonstrative man, often silent and reflective. But he had passions, and one was for poetry, which he would recite in private conversations. Gerard Manley Hopkins and Robert Frost were particular favourites. And it was poetry that allowed him to express strong emotions and feeling. A mutual friend of Heather's and mine wrote of his poet's heart. And I can recall now a birthday for Catherine. Some years ago, Allan stood up and declaimed John Donne's poem, The Sun Rising. Busy old fool, unruly sun, a poem about lovers disturbed in bed by the intruding morning sun. And he showed then such evident love for Catherine. And for many of us, it never was just Allan, but always Allan and Catherine. Allan was not a practical man. Catherine was the practical side. In Washington, I saw her juggle raising a young family while at the same time, with a newborn baby, she was studying for an MA at Maryland University. And in Canberra, I saw how she held back her own career to support Allan and give time to the boys. So all of us, including me, who benefited so much from Allan's generosity with his time, his patient reading of drafts, and giving advice, owe much to Catherine. All that time was time she did not have with him. So thank you, Catherine. Thanks very much.
And Allan did, of course, love his family above all else. And now I would like to ask two of his children, Dominic and Christopher, to speak to us.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. My first memory of Dad was of him singing. He was standing by a window at our house in Singapore, watching a tropical storm roll in. I don't remember the song, but Mum tells me it was likely Pink Floyd, which they were listening to a lot at the time. I realised a lot of my early memories of Dad were related to music. My early happy memories of sunny weekend mornings in Canberra listening to Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Neil Young, Fleetwood Mac. I remember his immersive lessons in Irish folk music, which I realise in retrospect sounds more like a form of child abuse. Movies and books and music were the hobbies I shared with Dad, as did my brothers. While he would sincerely pretend to care about our sporting achievements, his heart was never in it. A lot of the music, authors and films that have shaped me growing up and are still important to me came from him. Every birthday there would be an extra Dad present, which was always a book perfectly curated for the age and time. My brother Joe had an even stronger musical connection to Dad. All of the songs today were picked by him based on a lifetime of Dad's listening. Joe also inherited Dad's musical talent, which frustratingly passed some of us by. Dad gave us all a love of words. Throughout school and uni, my brothers and I realised this resource available to us and developed a habit of using Dad as a final proofreader and editor. We would finish a draft around 3 a.m, leave it on the kitchen table, and by the time we woke, we had edits, notes and suggestions on our essays, always on point and always worth a good fistful of marks. I should have given him a graduation present instead of the other way around. As I grew into adulthood, our relationship changed, as it does. We spoke less, but I knew that every time I arrived home, I would be welcomed with a hug and a warm kiss, and there would be the dinner table chats about anything from sci-fi to astronomy, from history to bioethics. There was the Saturday morning ritual of having every single Australian newspaper all sorted by section, which he would systematically work through. I can't believe that next Saturday he's not going to be at that table with his newspapers with the Irish folk on in the background. He was as happy as he ever was in later years. When he retired, he was free to take up his hobbies. It turns out his hobbies were indistinguishable from the work he just retired from. He loved pottering in his study, reading and writing and chatting about the state of the world with whoever reached out. His phone was always on. He loved his grandchildren and had the time and the energy to enjoy them. He was happy to sit and play and read and even throw a rugby ball when pressed. On the birth of his first grandchild, Dad was asked how he would like to be addressed. Granddad, Pop. I would like to be called Grandfather, he said. And so he was, right up into the Dada rebellion of young Otto. When he found out he was sick, Dad was stoic from the start. He said he'd had a good life, a career he was proud of, a family he loved, and a lifetime of happy memories. And he was blessed, being able to do something you love as a career, feeling like you're able to make a difference, having the same group of close friends around you for over 50 years, and a large family that loved him. And as Jeremy said, he was also blessed in his marriage. Mum and Dad met when they were 18 on the lawns of the University of Melbourne. That meeting led to a 55-year partnership that took them all around the world. One of the themes of the tributes that came in about Dad when he passed away was how generous he was with his time, and that was absolutely true. The flip side of that particular coin is the need to have a loving, supportive, and sometimes patient wife. Changed dinner plans and cancelled holidays were met with resignation, sometimes quiet, sometimes not. Mum was there for Dad when they packed off for Burma at the age of 22, and she was there for him at the end. So Dad was blessed, and he knew it. The way he saw it, a 75-year-old getting cancer is not a tragedy. As always, he'd done the analysis and he had the answer. But of course, for us, it is a tragedy. We feel robbed of years of dinner table chats, the music, the laughter, the way he could convey a range of emotions with just the raising of an eyebrow. It's doubly painful coming so soon after the loss of our brother Toby. When Dad passed away, we were enormously comforted by the kind words and tributes sent in by so many people. We will be forever proud of Dad and his achievements. His main goal in life was just to make a positive contribution to Australia, and he can rest easy knowing that he achieved that. When Dad's own mother passed away in 1999, he concluded that funeral service by saying, in reference to his mum, "I was lucky to have her, and I have her still. Not for the first time, I can't improve on Dad's words. I was lucky to have him, and I will have him with me always, singing to Pink Floyd as the storm rolls in."
Hi everyone, I'm Chris, Allan's youngest son. I want to start just by thanking all of you here today. Our family has been touched by the outpouring of support we have received since Dad's death. I knew, of course, that Dad had a great influence through his work, but what I hadn't truly appreciated was he personally had had such a profound impact on countless individuals. Charles Darwin once said that a person's value could be gauged by the friendships they've nurtured. And it is clear that Dad was extraordinarily rich indeed. I especially want to thank Dad's good friends, Sandy, Rick, Dennis, Rick and Jeremy for their help with planning this memorial, and for all the other speakers for their kind words and reflections on Dad's life. I want to talk about my dad and wisdom. When I was a teenager, I was going through a growth spurt once, and I boasted to Dad that soon I would be taller than him. He replied with a wry smile of his, "Chris, you'll probably soon be taller than me, and you'll probably be stronger than me too, and I expect you'll be smarter than me very soon as well. But you'll never be wiser than me." As a cocky teenager, Dad's words stuck with me. But his response also reveals something about his character and what he was like as a person and as a parent. He didn't need or want to be the smartest in the room, or the one who was on the right side of the argument, or who was the best at something. Likewise, as a father, Dad was supportive, but somewhat ambivalent about us getting good grades, or winning competitions. Dom, Joe and I all have bonded over Dad's seemingly indifference to our sporting school success, which we thought were very impressive in our own words. But what Dad did do, quietly, stealthily, but very deliberately, was to teach us all how to think for ourselves and how to think deeply. Dad nurtured our interests, be it in music, films, science, history, or whatever. He discussed topics with us deeply. He wasn't such a fan of chit-chat, but when you got him onto an idea, that's when the real Dad would come out and we'd see his best qualities. And it's really in these discussions with Dad that I think I learnt the most from him. Not directly from the many extraordinary diverse range of facts that he could bring down in a conversation very quickly, but in the way he would discuss topics. An ancient proverb about wisdom from both Greek and Tao philosophy is, "Wisest are those who know they do not know." Wisdom entails embracing limits to your knowledge, identifying gaps in your understanding. In all my discussions with Dad, he embodied this form of wisdom. He was always measured and balanced. He was never overconfident, and he always had humility. He was comfortable saying, "I don't know," or "I could be wrong." He taught me that uncertainty is something to be embraced rather than avoided. And he taught me not to measure myself by comparison to others, be it in my personal life, on the sporting field, or in the classroom. Even as very young children, Dad fostered in my brothers and I a curiosity, an inquisitive and healthily skeptical mindset. He would question how I could be sure of things that I don't see with my eyes. He made me think about my reactions and feelings. One memory stands out when I was quite young. I think I was 7 or 8, and I had crashed my bike, had a graze on my knee. Then I was playing on the couch and I fell and something hit my head, and I was complaining to Dad. I said, "Dad, I've had a really bad day. I've fallen over, I've grazed my knee, I've hit my head." And he said, "Well, Christopher, that sounds like a very, very good day to me. You've fallen off your bike, you've been hit in the head, but look at you, you've got no serious injuries. You're here smiling and eating. You should be thankful for the good day you've had." Discussions and his comments like this really had a profound impact on my identity and who I became as a person. Since I was a teenager, I have been fascinated with philosophy, and this was another interest of mine which Dad nurtured, and this one turned into a career. As I progressed through my career in philosophy, I would sometimes wonder, contra Dad's assertion, that maybe one day I could match or surpass Dad's profound wisdom. But the sad truth about the anecdote I told is I actually never even got taller than Dad, let alone wiser. It is my discussions with Dad about ideas that I will miss the most, either sitting around the dining table before a family dinner, on the deck of a beach house in the summer, or going for walks with my kids and I, discussing new ideas with him, hearing his carefully thought through perspectives, and basking in his wisdom. And in speaking about Dad's incredible life, I would also like to acknowledge my wonderful mum and the central role she plays in Dad's happiness and success. Mum has a unique ability to make those around her feel securely loved. It's a priceless gift that she's given to everyone in our family. It was only possible for Dad to flourish as he did because of the foundation of love provided by Mum. Dad was blessed with a deep inner peace that arises from being in a loving relationship with a partner who both challenges you intellectually and supports you unquestionably. Thank you very much.
Sorry. I won't do it now, Christopher, but we'll save it for over a drink. But remind me to tell you sometimes what your dad said to me once about his admiration for your brother Dominic's ability to write an essay at university that fell in with the then dominant stupidity of postmodernism in order to get some good marks, but saying things that Allan was absolutely sure you couldn't possibly believe. Now it's my very great pleasure, and this will almost draw our proceedings to an end, to introduce 3 of Allan's grandchildren, who I think will come up to the stage together, and that would be Seb, Sav, and Annie. Thanks, guys. That wire's a bit talkative if you stand.
Hi everyone, I'm Xavier, this is Seb and this is Annie, and we'd just like to say thank you for everyone for coming today. Growing up overseas, we got to know grandfather through Skype and seeing him on holidays. He always seemed like a wise and mysterious man, but the more we saw him, the more I saw the funny side of him. It may surprise those of you who knew him well that we actually convinced him to play beach cricket with us once. Grandfather was endlessly patient through our practical jokes and demands to play, and his tolerance for our whoopee cushion pranks were particularly admirable. It seemed like the more grandkids he had, the more of his silly side came out. I'll never forget watching him play with Otto and Clara or running down the sand dunes down the coast. I will always admire his ability to raise one eyebrow, and I'm quite disappointed that I haven't inherited that genetic trait. Grandfather has inspired such a great family, and holidays will never be the same. We miss him now, and we'll miss him always.
Cheers, Av. I'm Seb. I'm Allan's first grandson, which by default I'm the favourite. Only very few of you were lucky enough to know Allan as a father and a grandfather. Some of my fondest memories of my grandfather include the 30 minutes of reading we did together every day while on holiday, and the countless exhibits and museums he took us to. Grandfather always did his best to entertain us and relate to us when it came to sport. I remember when Zav and I came to Canberra, he raced down to our room to tell us he'd got the rugby on TV. I asked him what teams were playing, to which he responded, "I could not tell you." Another thing many of you may not know about Allan was that he was an amazing chef. Understandably tough for all of you to picture him in a Santa Claus apron and a paper crown wrapped around his head. But these were the images myself and the rest of his grandkids grew up with. I'll miss watching grandfather lose to Otto in Christmas cracker competitions, and I'll miss watching him chase Clara and Hardy around the living room. It's these memories that show the warm-hearted and nurturing grandfather that he was. I love you and I'll miss you, grandfather, and I only wish we could read together for another 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Hello, distinguished guests. My name is Annie, and today I have come here to remember and talk about Allan Gyngell. Most of you got to know him through his work in foreign policy, but I knew him as grandfather. Memories are an important part of your life. When you think back, you get a warm, fuzzy feeling that makes you feel loved. Some of my happiest memories are of my grandfather and I. From him sharing interesting facts with me at Sunday dinners, to asking me what book I was reading. It's the little things that can have so much impact. He was my inspiration and a role model to me. One of the things that I loved about grandfather was how he always approached things with a calm and rational mindset, and even if I got up to mischief with my cousins, which was often, he would never get cross at us. So as I stand here today, remembering grandfather, I know that I will love him forever, as will my little brother Otto and sister Clara, and we will keep his memory in our hearts forevermore. Thank you.
And now please enjoy photographs which we'll show, and another piece of music chosen by Joe for Allan.
Traveling appallingly alone on a singular road into the lavender fields that reach high beyond the sky. People ask me how I changed. I say it is a singular road, and the lavender has stained my skin and made me strange. The lavender is tall and reaches beyond the heavenly cover. I plow through this furious world of which I'm truly over. and sometimes I hear my name. Oh, where did you go? But the lavender is broad, and it's a singular road. Once I was running with my friends, all of them busy with their pens, but the lavender grew red. What happened to them? Sometimes I see a pale bird wheeling in the sky, but that is just a feeling when you die.
What wonderful memories, and I would just like to finish on a happy one out of the many I could pick. I remember when Allan arrived in Washington, D.C. on posting, and I and my wife were already there. Catherine was coming over later, but Allan arrived and he came out to our lovely house in the rather affluent Washington suburb of Tulip Hill. I think it was springtime, probably. He came in, sat on the back deck, looked out at this quintessential American suburb, gave him a drink, and he sat back happily and said, "I feel like I've just walked into an episode of Leave It to Beaver." This is like the telephone box for younger people. I'll need to... It's a very retro reference. I'm sorry, just one more. I must mention, because we talked earlier about Allan's contribution in the public service, and I remember when the new managerialism, as it came to be known, came in. This was the notion that the private sector did everything better than government, and we should import as many practices from the private sector as possible. Excuse me, Stephen, sometimes that's true, but not always. In came KPIs. And they had to be quantitative KPIs, and there was key performance indicators. And there was much discussion amongst those of us doing policy work, as opposed to delivering programs, on how you could have quantitative KPIs. There were hundreds of meetings on this vexed question. And I remember in the end, Allan just saying, "Well, if they insist, I'll bloody well tell you what my quantitative KPIs will be. I will just have somewhere between 4 and 7 really good ideas every year." And of course, he did have those good ideas. He made a very significant contribution to our country in helping put them into effect. But still more important than that are two things, and I finish on this. The first is that Allan was a wonderful human being. He was He was highly intelligent, he was creative, utterly reliable, principled, sensitive, caring, and wonderful company. And secondly, he was a great friend. If you have in your life one friend as good as Allan, then you're very lucky. And we've all been very lucky. That said, thank you once again for coming today. Thank you again to Catherine for giving us this opportunity, and to the family for giving us this opportunity. And on a lighter note, as Allan might have said, for heaven's sake, let's now have a drink, let's mingle, let's share our memories, and let's celebrate together a wonderful life. Thank you all very much. You are now free to rush to the bar.